Here's something fun to think about. You know how when you watch a YouTube video, the guy's always like pointing to the bottom of the screen, like, "Oh, I got a Patreon page, check it out, and the link's below." It's really just a dude sitting in his living room in front of his computer monitor, gesturing at his crotch and telling you to check it out. It's July 18, 2016. This is your badass of the week. Check it out. Magister Militum Flavius Stilicho was the last great hero of the Western Roman Empire. At a time when all of the noble, patrician, fat cat losers around him were busy being a bunch of obnoxious, lazy, backstabbing sycophants more obsessed with slaves, jewelry, and over-the-top hair products than the safety of the empire, this old-school, stoic, honor-bound, barbarian-smiting warhammer of imperial justice was out there proving that even though she was dying and decaying from the inside, the Roman Empire still had the blood of Caesar, Scipio, Marius, and Agrippa coursing through her veins. He rose from the rank and file of the Roman legions to serve on the emperor's bodyguard. He married the emperor's daughter. He took command of all Roman armed forces and defended the Eternal City from barbarian invaders at the gates, not once, but twice, despite being underfunded, outnumbered, and having every single logistical problem in the ancient world kicking him in the balls every time he tried to take a leak. In 20 years of military service to the Empire, this dude fought off unstoppable hordes of rampaging enemy soldiers with a handful of legionaries cobbled together at the last minute, and he defended the realm without ever sacrificing his personal honor or his duty to the Emperor. Nowadays, he goes down in history as the last great warrior of Rome, and his tragic death marks the end of the Western Empire as we know it. Flavius Stilicho was born in Germany around 365 AD. We don't know a whole lot about his early days because Romans didn't really bother writing down information about kids who didn't come from well-known, wealthy Roman families. But we do know that his mother was a Roman provincial and his father was a Vandal, which is a tribe of Germanic barbarian dudes who were super into smashing mailboxes with baseball bats and tagging graffiti on highway underpasses. Stilicho's dad was a cavalry officer serving in the Roman army as an auxiliary, and as soon as Stilicho was old enough to heft a gladius over his head, he enlisted in the military to get busy with the head cracking. He was a badass archer, horseman, and hand-to-hand fighter, a charismatic leader, a steel-plated tactical genius, and at a time when it was pretty common for soldiers from good families to just pay for military promotions like a dude trying to unlock a Counter-Strike skin, Stilicho never once accepted a promotion that wasn't based purely on merit. Stilicho first shows up in history in 383 AD, when he was selected to command an honor guard sent by Emperor Theodosius to negotiate and ratify a peace treaty with the King of Persia. Stilicho negotiated that shit like a boss, returned to Constantinople in triumph, flexed his pecs, and married the emperor's daughter Serena, who basically fell in love with him as soon as she saw his awesome six-pack. Marrying the Princess of Rome is pretty badass by itself, but Serena was a shrewd diplomat, and she was able to protect him from the machinations of his enemies. Her behind-the-scenes political skills are what kept this guy alive and in power at a time in history when most powerful men ended up futilely reaching around to try to pull 6 inches of blade that had just been embedded in their spines by their best friend. The emperor's son-in-law continued rising through the ranks of the military. He commanded the emperor's personal bodyguard and then was trusted with a sizable portion of the imperial army at the Battle of Frigidus in 394 AD. Stilicho opened the attack by sending forward his expendable barbarian infantry head-on into the enemy, which resulted in a lot of dead barbarians, which was fine by him, and while the enemy was busy chopping up all the Germans, Stilicho flanked around with the cavalry and broke the enemy forces with a pincer move. The enemy commander, Emperor Theodosius' brother, was captured and executed on the battlefield. The Emperor Theodosius died in 395 AD, and he left his empire to his 2 young sons, setting up a divide between East and West that would never be reunified again. Because the emperors weren't old enough to rule, Stilicho was put in charge of governing the West, and a total asshole named Rufinus was sent to help manage the East. Rufinus was a scheming, self-serving jerk who had willingly ordered one of Stilicho's best friends to his death, so clearly the next logical step was for the 2 sides of the empire to start killing each other. And that's totally what was about to happen, but then, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there was a rebellion by a tribe of long-haired Germanic warriors called the Goths. Oh, hey, remember a minute ago when I was talking about those barbarians who got mulched into sawdust during the Battle of Frigidus? Well, their commander was a guy named Alaric the Bold. It's a man you should be familiar with if you've read the first Badass book. And Alaric the Bold didn't get a nickname like that by sitting around and letting a bunch of sandal-wearing Roman D-bags use him as cannon fodder. Alaric the Bold declared himself king of the Goths, like a 5th century Morrissey, and he went to work devastating the Greek countryside at the head of a screaming horde of axe-swinging German marauders. Stilicho immediately raised the armies of western Rome, sailed across into Thrace, and crashed his armies headlong into the Goth menace. Bloodied and defeated, Alaric retreated further into Greece to escape the wrath of Stilicho and the Romans. Stilicho chased him, forced him up a mountain, and then surrounded that mountain with heavy siege engines. Over in Constantinople, Stilicho's old pal Rufinus decided that the only thing that made him more upset than a rampaging band of plundering Germans was a full-scale Roman army led by Stilicho walking all over his territory. So even though Stilicho had Alaric's nuts in a vice, he was ordered to back down and get the hell out of the east. Stilicho was pissed, but he agreed, and as a parting gift, he sent a couple of his troops over to Constantinople to murder Rufinus, which they did. Stabbed him to death outside of his own city. Stilicho returned to Italy to find that one of the provinces in North Africa had rebelled against the Romans, which honestly was just totally not acceptable behavior for these dudes. Their governor, a guy named Gildo, was refusing to send food to Rome and declared himself king of an independent North Africa. Well, that wasn't going to fly. Stilicho first provided for the Roman people by importing food from Gaul. Then he went across the Mediterranean and beat some imperial sense into the rebel king with a couple javelins to the face, smashing Gildo's army so bad that Gildo killed himself. After dealing with that nonsense, Stilicho returned to Rome and cemented his claim to power by marrying his daughter Maria off to the 14-year-old Emperor Honorius, which is kind of gross because Maria and Honorius were first cousins, but Gibbon says that Honorius died a virgin, so I guess there's some small consolation in that. It's worth mentioning that Honorius is pretty much a worthless ruler with all the charisma of a week-old pre-chewed chunk of bubblegum. He spent all day in his decadent palace feeding his pet chickens and pigeons. He never showed any inclination to rule whatsoever, and pretty much anybody that met this dude in person immediately lost all respect for Roman rule and attempted a rebellion. Gibbon himself states in his own inimitable fashion that in the eventful history of a reign of 28 years, it will seldom be necessary to mention the name of the Emperor Honorius. Okay, so around this time, Alaric the Bold was getting pretty bored of reducing the cities and townships of Greece to blood-stained, burning rubble, so the king of the Goths set his sights on Italy and went full throttle across the Alps with the intention of beating the emperor to death with his own dismembered leg. Honorius, hearing reports of the rampaging onslaught of Visigoths beatboxing their way towards the castle, immediately prepared to flee for his life like a coward. Stilicho was like, hang on, I got this. Now, the Western Roman Empire at this point in time is completely falling apart. The vaunted legions of old are gone. There's a minimal standing army. There's not much money to raise one. The citizenry are either lazy or rebellious, depending on where they live. But Stilicho had a city to defend, and the only thing standing between the emperor's skull and a barbarian axe was the last great Roman warrior, and this guy was going to be damned if the empire was going to fall apart on his watch. Stilicho rode his horse hard across the Alps in the dead of winter, braved the ice and snow into Gaul, and started cobbling together every single fighting man in the Western Roman Empire. He recalled garrisons as far north as Hadrian's Wall in Scotland. He pulled recruits from German tribes that were among Rome's biggest enemies and stripped garrisons from cities. Basically, if you could hold a spear parallel to the ground and thrust it in a vaguely menacing way, you were going to get called up to face Shanks and Visigoths in a fight for your life. Alaric the Bold burned, plundered, and pillaged his way through northern Italy, finally arriving outside the emperor's palace in Milan in the spring of 402 AD. Honorius freaked out and ran for it, fleeing with an entourage of toga-wearing dignitaries who wore sandals to work and smelled like flowers all the time. The battle-scarred, warmongering Visigoths caught up to him, and the emperor had to take emergency refuge in a small walled fort just south of the Alps. The Goths surrounded the fortress, set up siege equipment, and prepared to capture themselves an emperor. But then, just as all appeared lost, on the horizon a lookout spotted something amazing. General Stilicho, protector of Rome, was swimming across the fucking Adua River with a vanguard of thousands of Roman soldiers. When they reached the near side of the bank, they pulled themselves out of the water and began lining up in battle formation. It was around this time that Alaric the Bold started receiving reports of Roman legionaries marching through basically every single mountain pass in the Alps, all streaming together towards the Goths' position in large sweeping arcs to block their retreat. In the moment of his greatest victory, Alaric the Bold was about to be completely surrounded by Roman soldiers ready to fight and die to protect the empire. The battle that followed was a crushing Roman victory. Stilicho captured Alaric's camp, took his wife prisoner, freed all the slaves Alaric had taken during the march, and recovered priceless treasures that had been looted from towns ranging from Constantinople to Rome. Alaric escaped with about half of his force intact and tried to attack the Italian city of Verona on his way out of town, but once again Stilicho beat him to the punch. Stilicho had bribed some of Alaric's disgruntled chieftains to spy on him for Rome, and when Alaric emerged from the mountain pass outside Verona, he was attacked on 3 sides by Roman forces and smashed to pieces. For being a defender of Rome, Stilicho was given a triumph through the streets of the city. Sitting in the spot of honor next to the emperor, Stilicho led a parade of his victorious soldiers, prisoners, and treasure, while all the citizens of the city came out and cheered their hero. In the last 100 years of the Western Roman Empire, only 3 men received this honor, and Stilicho was the only one of them who accomplished the feat without having to kill other Roman citizens in the process. It's not really related, but it's worth mentioning at this point that this was actually the last gladiatorial combat that ever took place in Rome. They did the parade, and then they had the games, and at the Colosseum they were doing gladiator fights, and there was an Asiatic monk. His name was Telemachus, and he came running out into the middle of one of the gladiator fights, and he tried to push the 2 combatants apart from each other. The crowd got super pissed and beat him and killed him by throwing rocks at him. But Honorius was in the stands to watch all this go down. He was so horrified by what he saw that he banned gladiatorial combat, and that's the end of it in Rome. But as I've said, these are dark times for Rome, and it wouldn't be long before Stilicho was going to need to save his people once again. This time it was in 405, when a humongous horde of Ostrogoths crossed the Danube River under the command of a warrior named Radagasius, and began immediately creating chaos, mayhem, and destruction. Stilicho once again cobbled together an army out of nowhere. He promised freedom to slaves who would fight for him. He abandoned defenses anywhere he could spare it. And he somehow put together 30 legions worth of Roman infantry to stare down a Gothic horde that easily outnumbered him 3 or 4 times. Time was short, and Radagasius' Goths were moving much too quickly. By the time Stilicho had finally built a half-decent army, he was receiving word that the Gothic army had already surrounded Florence and was attempting to starve the population into submission. Stilicho was going to have to work quickly if he wanted to save the people of that city, and the people of Rome, who were only about 180 miles away from Florence. Stilicho marched his army as hard as they would go. The people of Florence held out bravely, thanks in no small part to inspiring speeches from St. Ambrose. And then, just when it was starting to look like the Ostrogoths were going to break through the city defenses, as Gibbon puts it, all of a sudden they beheld from their walls the banners of Stilicho, who advanced with his united force to the relief of that fateful city, and who soon marked that fatal spot as the grave of the barbarian army. Stilicho couldn't afford to lose his valuable troops in a battle in the open, so he took a page out of the Julius Caesar playbook. He surrounded the besiegers and set up a humongous series of defensive works that bottled the Goths up in a ring around the city. Radagasius tried multiple times to break out of the trap, but Stilicho's Romans held the line against wave after wave of barbarian attacks. Disease, hunger, and attrition ravaged the Goths. When Radagasius met with Stilicho to make peace, Stilicho arrested him and sent his head back to the Goths in a catapult. When the rest of the Goths surrendered, he had them all sold into slavery. Because that's what happens when you fuck with the Roman Empire when they're led by a badass Roman commander. Stilicho continued to kick ass for Rome, putting down a Vandal invasion and containing a rebellion in Gaul. But despite all the heroics he'd accomplished for the empire, Stilicho still wasn't completely immune to subterfuge and political backstabbing. First, the Senate thought Stilicho had gone soft when he agreed to pay Alaric the Bold not to attack Italy again, which is dumb as hell because negotiating peace to avoid an unwinnable battle is a hell of a lot smarter than having your homeland burned to ash. Then some of Emperor Honorius' advisors, jealous of Stilicho's power and influence, started convincing the emperor that Stilicho was going to overthrow him and seize power, or that Stilicho couldn't be trusted because he was half German and therefore had divided loyalties, or something. A large number of Stilicho's friends and top generals were ambushed and murdered by their own men in 408 AD. A barbarian warrior broke into Stilicho's tent as part of the conspiracy and tried to murder him as well, but Stilicho defeated that guy, escaped, got to a church, and asked for sanctuary so he could write a letter telling the people of Rome never to open their gates to barbarians and to defend their empire and their cities to the last man. When imperial soldiers finally came to Order 66, Stilicho, the great Roman hero, went outside with them willingly and was executed by beheading in the church courtyard. He was 49 years old. Less than 2 years after his death, Gothic armies under Alaric the Bold invaded Rome once again. With no great heroes left to defend their empire, Alaric encircled Rome in 410 AD, stormed the walls, and his barbarian warriors sacked the city with sword and fire for the first time in 1,000 years. All right, guys. So that's Stilicho. It's kind of a bittersweet story, but it's a good one, and it's one that came through the Patreon site. So I just want to say thanks to the backers on there real quick: Jameson, Lucius, Shelby, Christopher, Steve, Travis, Danny, Sean, and Burton. Thanks for backing me on there. I appreciate it. All right, I'll catch you guys next week.